mistake. Sorry once again. Perek Hey Pasuk Tet. Last week we stopped the perek in the middle because the next scene is an independent scene, and there's some questions of what its purpose is. Because if you remember where we had left off at the beginning of the perek, Esther had invited both Haman and Haman and Achashverosh to her feast, to her banquet, to the Mishtem. And in an unusual move in all of this, she had everything prepared. It was a Mishtem for the Melech, but she also included the second in command, which raises all sorts of questions, why she chose to do this and what Achashverosh was thinking at the same time. The one thing that's very clear based on Pasuk Tet is that what Haman was thinking was, this is the best thing since sliced bread. Vayetze Haman bayamahu sameach v'tov lev. He left, he was thrilled. Now, as I mentioned last week, if you compare this to the king's reaction after this Mishtem, which is in the first Pasuk of the next Perek, Pasuk Aleph of Perek Vav, by Lailahu Nadadashna Tamelech, the king is not able to sleep. He's troubled by it. We see this contrast, and we see that, again, how unusual it was to have invited Haman to the feast, how it could be misunderstood, and very likely how this was part of Esther's plan. But v'chirot Haman et Mordechai b'shar hamelech, when she saw Mordechai in the gate of the king, meaning back in his position of importance, he served as a shofet, v'lo kam v'lo zam imeno, and he didn't move at all when Haman passed him by. Vayemaleh Haman al Mordechai chema, and Haman just was infuriated. He was steaming mad, almost literal translation. Vayitapak Haman. Now, at this point, Haman is holding it back. He's holding it in. In other words, as Rashi points out, he's working very hard not to blow up at that moment. The Chachmei Tzarfat say that he doesn't want to show his anger at that moment. And the reason he didn't want to show him is, according to Moshe Chalava, very simple, because Haman has been elevated to this extraordinary position in the government. Haman's no dummy. Haman knows if he blows up at Mordechai at this point, it diminishes him. And so he doesn't want to blow up at him, but rather, and we see, we notice even earlier when it said, Vayivaz beinav lishloach yad b'Mordechai levado, it was beneath him in an extent. And that's why he chose to hold it back in. The Ibn Ezra has an interesting approach. So the reason he chose to hold it back in was different. He chose to hold it back in because he really couldn't blow up at him in public. Mordechai was back in the Shar HaMelech. It's one thing to get upset with the Jews. It's another thing to get upset with another official in the king's court. And at that point, he held it back. Vayavo el beito, and he comes home, vayishlach v'yaveh et oavav et zeresh ishto. And he goes ahead and he brings all of those people who are the closest to him, his ohavav, those who are his, nowadays we'd say pasi. Okay, he brings them all around, and he brings his wife, and the simple reason he's bringing them, he needs to seek some counsel. Vayisaper lehem Haman et kvodo shro v'rov banav. And Haman goes ahead, and Haman tells him that he first relays to him about the wealth. Look at my position, look at my wealth, look at Rov Banav, look at the number of children I have. It's an interesting piece here, Rov. There's all these wonderful drashot at the end of the Megillah, where we talk about that after everything has been successful, that Mordechai has found favor in everyone's eyes, v'ratzui l'rov echav, but it is for Rov. Now, Rov literally means the majority, not everyone. And so there's all these drashot that basically say that no matter what you do in a Jewish community, at the end of the day, there's still going to be people who are unhappy. Okay, you got the majority, feel good about it. No, someone's going to give you a rough time. The reality is Avram Moshe Haberman, who was in the 20th century Israel, was a very prolific author in a volume of Sinai, volume 32 in Sinai, which goes back to the early editions of the Sinai Journal. It was still edited at that time by Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon. That there he points out very clearly that Rov, he uses Gemarot and other pieces, Rov means Rui. It's about masses. He was the many children as opposed to anything else. And so here he's talking about the many children he has. And this is, he's starting in the same order, okay? Just like Achashverosh always talks about Osher Kavod Malchuto, look at my status, look at my family, not the other way around. And he says, "V'etasher gidulo hamelech v'etasher nis'o ala sarim v'avdei hamelech," and he tells them very, very simply how the king has lifted him up among all of the other people. Okay, you might want to say that just because he's rich doesn't mean he has power to do anything. No, he's rich and he's powerful. Vayomer Haman. And he says, by the way, the only one who came to this was me, pointing out of all the ministers, he's more important. And also tomorrow I'm going to be invited. So he's laying out the groundwork. I'm wealthy. I have a big family. I have power, I have position. It's immediate, this power position. And none of this is worth anything to me. It doesn't bring me any goodness, any joy at all. As long as I see Mordechai, the Jew, sitting in the gate of the king. Now notice, when he saw Mordechai, what was Mordechai's title then? In Pasuk Tet, Vayetze Haman bayom hahu sameach v'tov lev v'chirot Haman et Mordechai b'shar hamelech. He sees Mordechai in the Shar Hamelech. Now he's talking about Mordechai HaYehudi. It's not just him. He's generalizing it, as he did from the beginning, to the entire people. It's not just a battle, Haman, Mordechai. It's Haman, Mordechai the Jew, which makes it a different kind of conversation here. As long as I see this happening, and what he's saying is, it's as if all the things I have is nothing. Vatomer lo Zeresh ishto, and so Zeresh says the following: and all of the compatriots add into it. Yasu eitz gavoa 50 amma. Build a gallows that's 50 amot high. 50 amot high is somewhere between 75 to 100 feet tall. So 5 stories, 4 or 5 stories tall of a gallows. We're talking about a significant gallows. Now, why should this be a significant gallows? Okay, because what's interesting, well, if you look, not only everyone will see it, it's going to send the message. Don't fool around with Haman, that's for sure. It sends the message. And in fact, we find this halachically when a person, unfortunately, receives capital punishment, his body is displayed the rest of that day. It's a deterrent. We don't want to take any chances with people thinking anything else. However, and then the Malbim makes that same point as well. But what's fascinating about this is we have this idea in one other place. Okay, if you remember back in Perek Bet, Pasuk Chav Gimel, we have the story of Bigtan and Teresh, the two conspirators, the co-conspirators to overthrow Achashverosh. Vayivukash hadavar v'yimatzem. They looked into this matter and they found it to be true. It says there, Vayitalu shnehem ala etz, and they also hung him on a tree. What's the symbolism? Why hanging on a tree? So Jonathan Grossman points out very simply, that was the punishment for rebels. For people who are trying to overthrow a government, that's a punishment. Now, if you imagine what's going on here, when we go back to this idea of Mordechai and the Shar HaMelech, it's true, Haman is more powerful than all of the other ministers in the government. But still, for him to kill another minister may be beyond his ability, or maybe beyond the ability of others to accept it. He's got all these other people around who are also in the inner circle. He may be the closest in his mind, but there are other people in this inner circle. And if there are other people in the inner circle, and Haman starts knocking him off by killing Mordechai first, what are the others going to do? They may not let him get away with it. But if he gives them the punishment that's given to a person who's trying to overthrow a government, the very same, we're saying, I'm doing this to Mordechai, not because I don't like Mordechai, not because Mordechai is not bowing down to. I found out that Mordechai is trying to kill the king. He shifts the focus. I'm giving him the same punishment that everyone else who did such terrible things against the monarchy would receive. So he makes it something that's possible. This is Zeresh's idea. The Orvav are in agreement. By the way, it's entirely possible that despite the illustrations that we have in old Megillot, and despite the illustrations you have in some of the Megillah comic books, that these weren't gallows, but these were actually crosses, the equivalent of a crucifixion that was taking place here. That was the punishment that was not so uncommon in those days. But do it 50 feet up, uvaboker emor lamelech, and tell the king about it. Vayitlu et Mordechai alav, and hang Mordechai on it. Uvoim amelech al mishteh sameach. And he said, then you'll be able to be happy, you'll be nice, everything will be happy about it. And Mordechai goes out and he does it. The Alshich points out something fascinating. Who builds the gallows? Now, from a Pashtan perspective, from a perspective of simple pshat, and we find this going back into the Chumash, Vayas Betzalel, that Betzalel goes ahead and makes the Mishkan, and Vayas Moshe is the one who, Vayakov Moshe puts it up. All of those things that sometimes we assign verbs to the person who was responsible, we give them the credit. So Haman goes ahead, he gives the order, he tells his builders, put up a 50 amma gallows. Haman did it. Vayas Haman. However, the Alshich says no. He says that Haman actually built it himself, Shasin'a mikalkelet et hashura, that hatred violates all forms of protocol. We had this way back when with Bilam, if you remember. We had the opposite, Hava mikalkelet shura, with Avram Avinu going to the Akedah where he saddled his own donkey. All of these things, when you have extreme emotion, protocol falls by the wayside. It can be extreme good, extreme bad, but protocol falls aside. So the Alshich says this is actually a case of Haman actually building himself. Now, the question which I really wanted to deal with last week, and the reason why I held these last few psukim, which did take us about 15 minutes to do, 10, 15 minutes to do, and we had about 3 last week. But the reason I really held it was to ask a more basic question. And the basic question is, why do we need this story here? What is the purpose of this scene within the Megillat Esther?
What went out?
The fuse by the shower.
Okay, the Megillat Esther. So, for example, in Megillat Esther, what we have is, we have the story, Haman getting a new wife. Okay, we need that for Esther to get into her role. Mordechai not bowing down to Haman. We question why Mordechai chose to do that, but we need that to create that antipathy between the two of them, right? Haman coming up with his decree to take care of the Jews, to kill the Jews. Okay, we need that because we see the response of Mordechai, we see the response of Esther. The 2 feasts are taking place. We even understand big time V'teresh based on the next pasuk, why we need it. But next parak based on why we need it. But why do we need this story within this episode? What does it add to us? And so there's a lot of different opinions about it. But the first one to consider is, we need it just to explain why Haman is going to show up early in the morning in the next parak. The next parak, Haman is going to be the only one outside the king's chambers. And therefore, when the king is not sleeping well and he's gone through his chronicles and he's heard about this and he needs to call somebody in, that's why he's there. But it still seems to be a pretty big story to just set up that one detail of why Haman was going to be there. And so there are a number of different approaches that are suggested. Among modern commentaries, Mordechai Breuer suggests that really what we need to understand is that there are two battles that are taking place throughout this episode. There is the battle between Haman and Mordechai on a personal level, and there is the battle between Haman and the Jewish people on a national level. And what the Megillah is trying to teach us here is that each of those continue, that each of those battles are continuing, that here, if you think about it, Haman in his mind has already succeeded on the national level. He's got the decrees going out that in 11 months we're going to kill all the Jews. That's done. He's been successful. But on the personal level, Mordechai is still driving him crazy. Because he could, by the way, say, his wife could have said, Haman, just hang in there. Another 11 months, Mordechai's done. You're killing all of his people. He's over. Leave him alone. Just move on. But no, this is also, there's a personal element to this as well, which may be also going back to the issue of trying to understand this Mordechai Sabato talks about of why Esther made sure to invite Haman to the Mishtem. Because again, if I look on this, if the story is two levels, the national versus the personal, Esther could have invited Achashverosh to his Mishtem, and he could have not had Haman there, and she could have appealed to him, and she could have extracted from him a promise. Just like he gave a promise to Haman, and he's later on we know he can't retract it, anything done with the ring can't be retracted. He could have at that point given some kind of promise to Esther and somehow taken care of matters. Why invite Haman there? The inviting of Haman, says Sabato, is because there's still that personal element. We're not just trying to save the Jews, we want to take down Haman. We have to do both at the same time. And so you have this confluence of the private story and the public story. And that might be the reason. Or it could be as simple as I started with in saying, no, we just have to explain why Mordechai was going to be there first thing in the morning. It's not normal for him to be there. Okay, and in fact, we know it's not normal from the mere fact that Achashverosh is asking who's out there making noise. So we're not sure. We're really not sure. But this piece of story in some ways, is a little bit of a side trip from the direct story of what had been going on until now. Until now, been going on a real direct path. Boom, boom, boom. Step A, B, C, D, E. We now did A, B, C, D. Went off to the side E, back again, and now we're going back into F. And now we get to Perek Vav. And Perek Vav is Balayla Unadadash Shnat HaMelech. Now, in that night, okay, the king just couldn't sleep. Why couldn't he sleep? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. Rashi mentions two of them. One of it may have been God inspired, that this was a miraculous piece. Interestingly, we've no source for that comment of Rashi, that he says Nesaya, that was a miraculous. There's another possibility is he's really troubled by what had been going on with these feasts. He can't understand why Esther invited Haman and why she invites him again. It's totally against protocol. We find elsewhere, by the way, that in historical documents that when it came to Persian kings, the only one who ever ate with the king was either the family at the most, the wife, the family. You didn't have other people eating with the king. But okay, doesn't understand. Now, in the Gemara and Megillah, there's another famous medrash. Okay, because if you look here, the king can't sleep. Well, obviously, Rava says that the king, Achashverosh, can't sleep. But Rabbi Tanchum gives a famous alternative. He says, no. The Melech is the Malkos Shel Olam. God couldn't sleep. That this is where God now is going to intervene in a way that we couldn't imagine until now. Until now, all the rest of the things seemed plausible. Here, all of a sudden, that precisely that night, he's going to not be able to sleep, and precisely that night, he's going to look up Mordechai, and precisely all of these things happen, seems to be divine intervention. And so what did he do? Vayomer lavi et sefer zichronot divrei hayamim, vayu nikraim lifnei hamelech, and he said, to go ahead and bring the Chronicles and read them. Interestingly, there are some who just suggest very simply, if you can't fall asleep, bring the most boring book that you can, and it'll help you fall asleep. Maybe that's all he was trying to do. Okay. The Chachmei Tzarfat say, no, actually what he's trying to do is he's trying to regale. He can't fall asleep. He's feeling a little down, a little troubled. Let me read about all the great things I've accomplished in my life. Read it for me. Okay. Now, he also, at the very same time, if you remember, is beginning to get suspicious. And he's trying to figure out what's going on. And so the Ibn Ezra says that maybe he's thinking to himself, the reason he can't sleep is maybe something really legitimately is bothering him, something he needed to take care of that he hasn't taken care of. And so let's review the Chronicles. Let's see what I dropped. I'm going to go over my diary and find out what I dropped. And he found there what had occurred. Mordechai had turned in these two people, these two conspirators, Mishomrei Asaf, the ones who remember who'd guarded the entrance into the king's areas, who had wanted to kill Achashverosh. Interestingly, it says that until this point, Haman had been working at the fact, and he had been trying to take credit for Bigtan and Teresh. If you go ahead, we've experienced this, the big lie on both sides of politics. So I don't have to get myself in trouble, since you can find whoever you want to apply it to. But when you want to do a big lie, at a certain point, people start believing it. And according to the Malbim, what had happened here was that, unfortunately, Haman had started taking credit for Bigtan and Teresh. And Achashverosh had forgotten that it was really Mordechai. And he says, now, wait a second, this is really Mordechai who saved my life. Now, why is it significant that Mordechai saved his life? Because if he's concerned about Haman, if there's some suspicion in the back of his mind, something's going on with Esther and Haman, he wants to know who's really loyal, who's on his side. Now he's discovered somebody on his side. What was done great for Mordechai on this? Notice in all of these things, it doesn't say Mordechai HaYehudi yet, right? It's all Mordechai. This is my officer, Mordechai. What was done great for him? And of course, as we know, we say, nothing has happened. And so the king says, okay, now, why do you say who's outside? Well, the simplest explanation, the Chachmei Tzarfat says, okay, I need some advice. I always have these advisors hanging around. Who's outside? Maybe someone can help me. But Rav Victor Cohen said that another Rishon suggested it's different. He says, think about his mindset. He's suspicious. He's concerned. He doesn't know what's really going on here. He's just heard about one more time where there were these people who tried to kill him. And then he hears people early in the morning walking around outside his chambers. His response is not, who's outside? I want to get their advice. But rather it's, who's outside? What's going on out there? What's happening out there?
That makes a lot more sense with his, Esther's concern about that she can't just approach him, and she is family.
Well, she can't approach him. Now, it might be, by the way, for a close advisor may have been able to approach a lot easier than one of the many wives being able to approach. But you're right. He was hanging out there hoping to be called in. We can also assume, by the way, that there was a regular time of day that he would normally come into the king, because he never tells his wife, I can't go and ask the king or tell the king, right? But it is true. So here in this outer chamber, Rabbi Victor Cohen Tzedek says he's nervous. Okay. And in fact, there's a medrash which is mentioned in the Torah Shlema volume on Megillat Esther. The medrash says that actually what had happened here is he had had a dream. And in his dream, he had seen people who were trying to plot against him. And all of a sudden, he suddenly wakes up and there's someone moving around outside his chambers, and his reaction is, who's out there? This dream might be real. He's really getting it. And then he's beginning to become, a little more than suspicious. In fact, Rabbi Yeshua Bachrach says, when he hears this, his words is Hamelech Nivhal, the king is shocked. Kol psiot min hachatzer chitzona shama. He hears these footsteps from the outer chambers, v'ni'ur mishnato, and he wakes up. B'chalomo, ha'im rak hu shomea et hapsiot. Does he only hear the footsteps? Are they really there or not there? Okay, what he's trying to do, he's afraid at this point. And so he says, "Mi b'chatzer." And Haman ba'al hachatzer beit hamelech chitzona lemor lamelech litlot et Mordechai la'etz asher ichin lo. Of course, Haman had come unaware of any of the suspicions of the king. Haman had come, he was outside, he wanted to go ahead and make sure to tell the king to hang Mordechai. So they say, Hine Haman. Now, Hine, whenever you have the word Hine, it's an element of surprise or astonishment. And they say, this is strange. Haman's out there. We don't know what's going on. And so the king says, bring in Haman. Now, for a person who is getting a little paranoid, and the one he's paranoid about is Haman, bring him in could be Machiavellian in a sense. Better to keep him close than to let him prowl around there. Could be just, I got to find out what he wants, otherwise I'm never going to be able to go to sleep. Who knows what it is, but for the king and his mindset where he's at, according to these approaches, this is a very, very tense moment. Vayavo Haman, and Haman comes forward. Vayomer lo hamelech, and the king says, Ma la'asot b'ish asher hamelech chafetz bikaro. And so the king says to him, what should I do to a person who the king desires to honor him? What doesn't the king say to him? No, even more than that. What would you normally expect for the king first to say? Why are you here? At least give him a good morning. Okay. Can I help you? Something. He calls him right in. Okay. He calls him right in, and because he immediately wants to get to the action. This again is Bachrach. Bachrach says this fear, this paranoia by the king, he's got to get to the bottom of things. And so he says right away. Now, interestingly, the Malbim says that that Achashverosh is setting up Haman right now. This is a test. He knows that he is not saying who the person is, the object, and he knows that Haman is going to jump to the conclusion that it's him. Now, by knowing that Haman's going to jump to the conclusion that it's him, think about it for a minute. If you say, if I go to somebody and say, if there's a person I really want to do something nice for him, what do you think I should do? And someone says, write him a card. That's a really nice thing. So, and someone says, I think he's talking about me. Why don't you give him $500? Okay. Well, I now know what the relationship is. It's a relationship, it's that kind of here. Achashverosh is going to be able to find out the relationship. He realizes it, and therefore he's speaking to try to trip him up. And he's going to be very successful. Vayomer Haman b'libo, and Haman says to himself, who's the king want to honor more than me? Now, based on this, Vayomer Haman b'libo, the Gemara in Megillah says this is proof that the Megillah was written Beruach HaKodesh. Because if it isn't written Beruach HaKodesh, how would you know what this person was thinking? That's it. Okay, it must be Beruach HaKodesh. The only problem is the Ibn Ezra says, that's not the case. That when they wrote it, this was what they assumed, he's saying to himself. Okay, they remember all of this is not a direct transcript. This was a complete translation. There's no conversation between Mordechai and Esther originally. All of this is done, almost all of this we'd have to assume, is done in Persian or Babylonian or some other language. It's been translated and worked and reworked and re-edited to be able to teach the points. The mere fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name is not in it is not because they forgot to mention HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name. It's because it was chosen not to be written in there. We dealt with different reasons why they may have chosen to do so. But ultimately here, he goes ahead and he says to himself, it must be me. Vayomer Haman el HaMelech, and the king, and Haman says to the king, Ish asher HaMelech chafetz bikaro, let me tell you, if there's a person who the king really wants to honor. Now, here, what's strange is that's the end of a pasuk. Any good English teacher, okay, Sam will check with Tirza, will say this is a fragment. It's not a sentence. Why is there a fragment there? Vayomer Haman el HaMelech, Ish asher HaMelech chafetz bikaro, the one who the king wants to honor. What? There's no object in the sentence. So what's going on here? So Yeshua Bachrach says that this is actually Haman speaking, not really directly to the king. This is almost like it's blurting it out. He's like saying this, it's like a subconscious statement that comes out of his mouth. Oh, the one the king really wants to honor. And then he gets it, then he answers the question. Yaviu levush malchut, then bring all of these things. So that first piece of it may not be what was told directly to Achashverosh. It may be something different. But he says, bring levush malchut. Now the levush malchut is not just royal clothing, but asher lavash bo hamelech, which the king had worn. Reb Moshe Chalav says this is at the time of his coronation. Bring out the coronation robes. To that extent, in other words, Haman is making himself into a king. Okay, now the Rambam teaches a very simple rule. We know in the Rambam, and this applies not only to Jewish kings, but the same was true to an extreme with non-Jewish kings. He mentioned in Hilchot Melachim, Perek Bet, Halacha Aleph, Ein rochvim al suso, vein yoshvim al kis'o, vein mishtamshim b'sharvito, velo b'katro, velo b'echad miklei tashmisho. That when it comes to a king, nobody is allowed to use any of their things. So everything Haman is doing is completely against protocol he's proposing. Do the exact opposite of what you should be doing, which betrays what Haman is really thinking in his heart more than anything else. And not just that, Visus asher rachav alav hamelech, and take also the horse which the king has used, vasher nitan keter malchut barosho, and which has the crown on his head. Now, interestingly, this is one of those unclear pronouns, barosho, on his head. His head, most people immediately assume, like the Ralbag says, put the crown, the crown on the person, okay, which the crown of the person who's going to be riding on the horse. But the Ibn Ezra, the Rabbeinu B'Chayil says, no, you put the crown on the horse. Put the crown on the horse, okay, which is kind of strange. But if you look in the pasuk, okay, the last subject of the pasuk was the sus. The definition of the sus was the sus that the king had ridden. But the sus was the last subject. So whenever you have an unknown pronoun, what it applies to, you always go to the last subject, and that's why they say you put it on the horse's head, which I'm not sure what's worse, putting the crown on the horse's head or putting the crown on this person who you want to honor. I'm not sure what's worse. I could argue both ways. Doesn't really make a difference. All of it's pretty bad. V'naton halavush vasus al yad ish misarei hamelech apartamim, and then go ahead and give the clothing and the horse over to one of the officers, one of the partamim, and then they should clothe the person who the king really wants to honor. And ride him through the town and announce this is what should happen to a person who really wants to honor. Now, interestingly, if you look between Pasuk Chet and Pasuk Tet, something has changed in terms of what's supposed to happen. This is a question. This is a challenge. There's something missing. If you look in Pasuk Tet versus Pasuk Chet, there's one item missing. The crown. The crown isn't repeated. So the Ibn Ezra, in the first edition of the Ibn Ezra, they say the reason it wasn't done Because as much as Achashverosh, and I'm taking the Malbim and mixing it with Ibn Ezra, which isn't fair, okay, but the king is, the king is watching all of this. He's listening to all this. Haman is proposing something that is so preposterous that would have never been allowed in any other situation. Okay, to go ahead and use royal garb for a commoner, no matter how important the commoner is, that at one point when he mentions the crown, Achashverosh is furious. He doesn't say anything, but Haman looks at Achashverosh and says, "Oh, I went one step too far," and therefore, according to the Ibn Ezra, he backtracked one step. He says, "Take the clothes, take the horse, let's leave the rest out." The Oh, good. Don't leave anything out in Posuk. So ultimately in Posuk Yud, when Achashverosh says don't leave anything out, that's the basis of Moshe Chalav, who says, no. It was just like the Ralbag says, just when you repeat something, you don't always repeat it with the same detail. This was just a little shorter repetition. And when Achashverosh says don't leave anything out, it meant including the crown itself. Now, why hand it off to somebody else to do all these things? Because again, if you have somebody clothing someone else, it adds to the honor and the glory. You drop off a box, okay, that's nice. You drop off a box with a butler, now we're talking. So he goes ahead, by Yomer Hamelech leHaman, and so the king says to Haman, Maher, hurry up. Now, interestingly, why is the king telling him to hurry up? The king's got a very busy day. Excuse me, this is the morning. He's got to set this whole thing up. And by later in the day, he's got to be by Esther. He wants to move this thing along. He doesn't want to have any problem later on. And in fact, the Vilna Gaon takes that approach. He's rushing it along because this piece is a little bit of a distraction. Now, the other side of it says the Malbim, this has been a test all along, and Haman has failed magnificently on this test. You couldn't fail any better than Haman has finished. And so the king just wants to rub it in now. Okay, Maher. Again, you see there's no crown. And do it to Mordechai Yehudi, who's sitting in the Shar Melech. Don't leave anything out. Notice, this is the first time we call him Yehudi. Why is he being referred to as a Yehudi here? Why isn't he just being referred to as Mordechai? And it could be that the king is aware of the antipathy, of the hatred that exists between Haman and Mordechai, and that it's not just a personal, but it's also at a national level. There's something big. We don't know. By the way, we don't really know that to what extent the king is fully aware that his decree for 11 months down the road is against the Jews or not, or just because we don't really, Haman has talked about it in generalities, it's an Am Mefuzar Mufurad Ben Amim. We don't know, but let's assume for a moment he knew he was a Jew. And he knew this all going on. And here he's going ahead and he's just sticking in the knife and giving it a good twist at the same time. Maher, and do it against the Jew. Don't al tapel davar michol asher dibarta. Vayikach Haman et halavush ve'et hasus. Yeah.
It's very funny that you're Rabbi.
Yeah.
Saying, the king says, do this and work it. And Haman, who's usually mad at everybody, he hasn't even discussed here how mad he must have been, how shocked.
Right. So the mad we see later. The mad we see in a few psukim when he gets home. He can't express.
This is the point where he should be.
Well, but the problem is you don't show fury against a monarch. You show fury against an autocratic monarch. Your option is which side do you want the guillotine to hit you on? Okay, so there's no option. Okay, and by the way, if he gets mad at this, he betrays himself even more. Right now, he's giving advice to the king. He's been a good advisor. So what's there to be mad about? He's honoring someone who protected the king. Yeah.
So Haman's an evil person, I get it, and he's all full of himself, but he's also not totally stupid. It doesn't make sense to really say this to the king, because that's really pushing him. Like, I feel like, it seemed like it was really, overboard.
So, well, one is,
Yeah,
so
even if for
the question is, why would Haman come up with something like this? Isn't it too much? So I would go back, first of all, to that statement from Chazal when he was building the gallows himself as well. Remember, Sinam Kalkelet Tashuram. When there is extreme emotion of any kind, logic takes a hike. Okay. And here at this point, Haman was viewing himself, as he told to his family, I'm the number two. I'm the favorite. I'm everything. He got it in a private display by being invited to Esther's home. Now he has the opportunity to get it in a public state. And have this is putting it out on the billboards of the whole city. Look what the king wants from me. This is his ego playing it to the utmost. So I don't think it's stupidity. I think it definitely is misreading situation. There is no question that his having been invited to the Mishteh, according to much of Chazal, have compromised his position with the king, and he doesn't seem to be aware of it. He left that Mishteh sameach v'tov lev, right? He was just thrilled with himself when he left, and he wasn't at any point questioning why me. He didn't think that, this is kind of strange also. He thought, wow, this is what really is coming to me. So all of those things combined allow people to make really stupid mistakes. And it's not unusual, no matter how smart you are. We've had this, we could have a good time in politics with this. We could have a good time with this in communal leadership. We could have a good time with this on many other levels as well. Vayikach Haman et halavush v'et hasus v'yalbesh es Mordechai. And true, Alita, what you said, there's no word, or he doesn't say boo, right? Nothing. He just goes at it and he does it by Yalbesh and Mordechai, and he clothes Mordechai by Arkiveo b'chov ha'ir, and he parades him through the city by Yikra lefanav, and he calls out before him, Kacha yaseh l'isha asher hamelech chafetz bikaro. This is what happens when somebody really, the king really wants to do something on his behalf. Now, interestingly, Reb David Hansheka, I always mispronounce his name. He wrote an article in Megadim, one of the Gush journals, volume Chav Gimel, and he says if you look at the words and the way it's coming out, you could read these words that Haman is calling out in two different ways. You could read it the way we all do, as referring to Mordechai. This is what the king does for him. He dresses him up, he puts him on this horse, he does everything. Or if you change the intonation, it could be Haman crying about himself. Look at what happened to me. What has befallen me at this moment? It reinforces, there's a famous old phrase, mi pis sofrim velo mi pis sfarim, that very often, if you want to understand words, it's much better to understand it when it's the spoken word than the written word. Because the written word, you don't have the intonation. You don't know how it's being said. And here, the kacha yaseh ish, you could see it in both ways. It's an interesting point. Definitely not. The pshat, he himself says it right up front, is not the pshat. It's all done. And what happens? Mordechai goes back to his place. He doesn't make a commotion out of it. He doesn't have any issues. All of this, as Grossman points out, doesn't seem to have any impact on who he was, as opposed to when Haman gets the covet, it changes his whole attitude to things. He goes back to the Shar HaMelech, Haman nidchaf el beito, and poor old Haman, he's just beside himself. He goes to the house, Avel v'chafui rosh, and he is mourning, and he is covered his head. He doesn't know what to do. The Gemara Megillah, interestingly, does point out that Mordechai goes by Yashav Mordechai al Shar HaMelech. The Gemara Megillah says he actually returned once again to sitting in his mourning clothes, in his sak and ephod. The only problem we have with that, taking that medrash, is we said Ken Lavo al Shar HaMelech levush sak. We said you can't do that. So it's a question. There is a medrash that says that, but I don't have a good answer on how the medrash would explain the fact that you're not allowed to sit in the Shar Melech like that. Vayesaper Haman, and so Haman goes ahead and he tells what just happened. L'zeresh ishto l'chol ha'avav, to the same group of people who he had consulted with to try to find some solution for the Mordechai problem. And as a result, et kol asher karau, everything that happened to him. Vayomer lo chachama v'zeresh ishto, and his advisors all tell him, as well as his wife, imizera haYehudim, Mordechai. If Mordechai is really a person who is from the offspring of the Jewish people, im hachilota linpol lefanav lo tuchal, if you have already started to fall, you're never going to get up again. Kinafol tipol lefanav. This will be your downfall. Now, Haman told this whole story to his family. He's looking for some Rahmanas. Okay, the Rahmanas they gave him was, you're dead. You're just dead meat. Okay, and how is it possible? The question though is, until now, they never said anything. It was never Mordechai HaYehudi. They had all these plans. You can hang him, what's going on? So why is it that just now? So the im, in this case, is not an if, because obviously they know he is Mizera Yudim. They were aware of it all along. But the im is the im of kasher. Okay, when he is. And what this is, Yehuda Nachmiyash says this. He says very simply that based on a medrash of Chazal, umazo nimshala lekochavim v'nimshala la'afar, that the Jewish people are both compared to the stars and compared to the dust of the earth. Kishi yordin yordin ad la'afar. When we fall all the way. Ukisha olim olim lakochavim. But when we're on our way up, we go all the way up to the stars. And they see, in this case, that the trajectory, the wife and the Ohavim see the trajectory of what's occurring here. And they say, there is more to this. This Jewish people, when they start rising, they're never going to fall. This is the end of you. Okay, and as a result, they give him, but they tell him, the Vilna Gaon says that what they tell him, break down this gallows, get rid of the gallows, and go ahead and figure out a way to make peace. That's what they say. Yes, Sam, you have a question?
No, just a couple of points. You start with, I'll just focus on the near term. Haman still has some hope, because at the end of everything, he was the only one invited to Esther's party. So although there may have been a falling in here or some oops in the process, he says, well, tomorrow I'll find out really where I am, because he doesn't know that Ahasuerus doesn't know about it. So there's still that hope.
There could still be a hope. But Sam is saying that Haman may still have a hope. And we see this in the very next pasuk. Okay, if you notice, Odam medabrim imo v'sariseh hamelech higiu, right? They're still talking. They're still shaking him. Wake up. You got to figure out something else. But the servants of the king come. Ve'avhilu laviat Haman al mishteh asher asata Esther, and they rush him to go ahead and come to the mishteh. Now, this idea of rushing. Okay, if you think about it, all there's this constant pushing and movement. This is happening quickly. Remember, this entire story, or the crux of the story itself, is 3-4 days long, right? It goes, Yud Gimel Adar is when they, Yud Gimel Nisan, I'm sorry, is when they first make the decree about 11 months hence. And by the 16th or the night of the 17th already, Haman is going to be hung or hanged. So you have all of these in place. This is all a very fast story. And things are, when you go fast like this, part of the message, and this Jonathan Grossman also points out, part of this message is they're not controlling the actions. There's things that happen this quickly. There's other powers that are behind what's happening. So they're moving him from one step to the next. He's going from having been on the top of the world to the bottom of the world, and now possibly having hope or finding himself in another very complicated situation. Because if Haman thinks that Achashverosh had set him up, let's say Haman thinks, let's say that Haman had a copy of the Malbim, and he read the Malbim, and he finds out that this was a setup. The last place in the world he wants to be is in an intimate event with the king. He wants to avoid that at all costs. If he thinks the king doesn't know what's going on, this is probably where he doesn't want to be at this moment, because he's really not feeling so good. He could come out of the other one feeling top of the world, and now he's walking in. Talk about bad moods. He's about as bad as you can get. He's in mourning, and now I got to get dressed up and play nice and make pretend like I really like what's going on. Look what happened the last time I did it. If I take the approach of the Vilna Gaon, he's in a fighting mood. The Vilna Gaon says he should have gone, they're advising him, saying, make peace with this guy. You're never going to succeed. And he doesn't have a chance to do it. So it could be a fighting mood, or it could be, I don't want to be here because I have more important things to do to save my life. We'll find all those out. Yeah, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Most likely not. Yes.
It's interesting that first he speaks to the people and they refer to it, oh my God. And now they refer to, once he tells them what happened, stop them up. But now they don't let him.
Very good. Yeah.
No, that's great.
No, it's very good. Very good. We're going to stop here. And next week, we're going to pick up with Perek Zion, or yeah, with Perek Zion, just to let you know, just as a forspice, in preparation for Purim this year, Rabbis Liebtag, Bressler, and I are all planning all different kinds of things. There will be the WhatsApp, we'll start talking about Purim soon. These shiurim will be promoted online as they were, the recordings as well. And other than there's going to be a series of classes at night also on the Megillat on Purim as well. Keep an eye open for it. We're getting really close. Rosh Chodesh Adar Aleph is this week. That means we are 6 weeks away from Purim. Yeah.